Chapter 5. No Father of Mine. That wee blade nearly had kittens when your man told her it wouldn't be ready on time. I was in a queue at the passport office in Belfast, behind a big woman in a floral headscarf encasing tight plastic hair colours. She was providing me with an unsolicited running commentary on the progress of the passport application of each person in front of us. "I'd rather have an Irish passport any day," shouted the wee blade as she departed in tears, with a definite political edge to her indignation. "Well, she'll have a hell of a lot longer wait for a Free State one," asserted the big woman, subtly indicating to the remainder of the queue where she stood on the question of the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. "Wee Fenian," she whispered in my ear. It was just another normal day in Belfast, but I allowed the casual sectarianism of my fellow citizens to pass me by. I was getting married soon, and I needed a passport so that I could whisk Lesley away from the peace line for an exotic and hopefully, at long last, erotic honeymoon in the sun. I was determined to find a holiday destination beyond the radioactive fallout zone in Europe. Perhaps North Africa, where there was no danger that radiation from Chernobyl might artificially enhance our suntans. The nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union had cast a shadowy glow across the whole of Europe. There was even talk of radioactive sheep in Ballymena. I had taken a few hours off work to submit my passport application. I felt guilty taking any time off, but today I was going to be selfish and take a break for the sake of my future wife. Lesley and her mother had been planning the wedding with detailed military precision for months, so the least I could do was to get my part right. I had to find and finance an exceptional honeymoon to match what was clearly intended to be the finest wedding in the history of Balachi. A middle-class mid-Ulster wedding often felt light years away from our day-to-day life in the new lodge. As I stood in the slow-moving queue, I tuned out the observations of the woman in front of me by ticking off my work-to-do list in my head. I needed to complete an application for money to refurbish the pool table and buy new equipment for the youth club. The rips from misplayed shots and the burns from the resting cigarettes of hundreds of teenagers were bad enough, but last week, when I suggested that Mo should wait his turn, he had jumped on top of the pool table in his Dr. Martin boots, pointed the pool cue at me threateningly, and called me a specky bastard. The damage to the pool table was more permanent than the injury to my feelings. We also needed a new pool cue because Tonto had used the other one as an improvised spear to fire at a passing Saracen full of British soldiers. We also needed a new set of ping-pong balls since Big Mickey had drawn genitalia on the current set. There was so much work to do and so little time to do it all. I was still working mornings, afternoons and evenings every day. The drop-in centre needed repainted, the broken windows needed replaced, and new security grills were urgently required following the latest break-in. Then there were more funding applications, writing the prayer letter for supporters, and being available to the young people in an emergency. Suddenly, a tap on my shoulder and a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. "Hello, Mrs. Piper," I said, typically bad luck that I'd bumped into my parents' most obnoxious neighbour. "Anyway, how's your father? I hear he's been bad with his nerves since he gave up the drink." A silence ensued, but I was determined it would be brief. "Och, he's doing well now. He had a wee bit of depression, but he's back at work now, so he is," I replied calmly, trying to hide my horror that this woman was apparently so well informed about my father's mental health. "A wee spell in Purdysburn's nothing to be ashamed of, so it's not," she said, although her disapproving eyebrows contradicted her words. "Next!" shouted the imposing bespectacled gentleman behind the plastic screen at the front of the passport office, saving me from any further interaction with Mrs. Piper. "Enjoy your honeymoon, love," said the big woman in the front as she departed. "I hope your wee girl's not one of the wrong sort." Once my passport papers were successfully submitted, I popped around the corner to the model shop in Queen Street to buy a tube of glue for my ongoing model Dalek project. The last tube had mysteriously disappeared after Paddy had been to see me to ask if we would lift the ban he'd received from the youth club for spitting in a volunteer's face. I decided to walk home up Murder Mile for some exercise because I was aware of spending far too much time sitting at a desk. On the doctor's advice, I was walking more as well as playing squash with Lesley and endurance swimming against the wave machine in the Shankill Leisure Centre. As I dandered up the Antrim Road, I thought about all the young people in the youth club and all the family problems they were facing. Alcoholism, gambling problems, violent death, physical and mental illness. I prayed for each one, and I asked God to carry them through the problems in their lives. I asked God to help me to help them. When I arrived back at the flat, I hid the model glue under my wilting spider plant and got to work on the latest Children in Need application form. I was answering the question, in what way are the children in your project disadvantaged? With a statistic of 90% youth unemployment in the New Lodge, which I was certain would shock Pudsey Bear and Terry Wogan into giving us £300 for the pool table. When the phone rang. "Is that Tony?" asked a familiar voice. It sounded like Uncle Sammy, not my real uncle, but my parents' kindly next-door neighbour, although he sounded different because his voice was shaking. "It's Uncle Samuel. Can you come home right away?" I could hear screaming in the background. It sounded like my mother. Your father's taken seriously ill. Can you come home right now?" Uncle Sammy sounded as if he was distressed, but was trying hard to be calm for my sake. "He's dead," I heard my mother screaming. "He's dead! He's dead!" I felt my heart thump in my chest. I could hear another woman weeping in the background. It sounded like Auntie Jean, Sammy's wife, who was a good friend to my mother. "Can you come home quickly, Tony, son?" pleaded Uncle Sammy. I felt suddenly lightheaded, and as I blinked, it was as if I was out of my body and watching this scene from above. "He's dead!" I heard my mother shriek again and again. "He's dead! He's dead!" "I'm coming," I said, as I slammed the phone down. My head was spinning, and as I ran into the office next door, I was aware that my feet and hands were tingling. I must have looked awful, because when John Evans lifted his head from the accounts, he looked at me with great concern. "Can you give me a lift home now, please, John? My neighbours phoned to say my father is seriously ill." I heard myself stuttering, but I can't hear my mother screaming in the background. I think she was shouting that he's dead. There was silence in the car as my mind replayed the traumatic call. My mother's grief-stricken shrieks resounded in my head. When we arrived at the house, I jumped over the familiar rickety front gate and sprinted down the driveway. I noticed the Fiat Panda was parked carefully in the garage, but that the garage door was open. As I ran around the back of the house, I noticed momentarily that the wooden lid of the coal bunker had been recently repaired after years of remaining broken, much to my mother's frustration. I burst through the back door and found Auntie Ella, Auntie Jean and Auntie Maureen weeping in the kitchen. The last time I had seen all my lovely childhood aunties, who were all good neighbours rather than blood relations, looking so distressed, was the night our neighbour, Mr. Moore, was shot in his car in the street and died in my mother's arms. When they looked at my face, they cried even more. Auntie Ella's daughter, Heather, who was a policewoman and clearly experienced in these circumstances, ushered me into the living room. She took both of my hands and looked into my eyes. "I'm very sorry, Tony. Your daddy has taken an overdose and he's dead," she explained. He is dead, I thought. It was true. I hadn't imagined it. Where's Mommy? I had to go to her, to hold her, to comfort her, to be a man for her. "Upstairs with him," said Heather, with tears in her eyes. I ran up the stairs to my parents' bedroom, and when I entered the room, I joined an unforgettable scene. My father was lying still on the bed in his foundry clothes, eyes closed as if he was just sleeping. I fell to my knees beside the bed, ignoring the living people around me and somehow hoping it wasn't true. But when I kissed his forehead and held his hand, his skin felt so cruelly cold. The same hand that once held mine tight whenever I was scared of the bogeyman at night now felt colder than it had ever felt in my life. As I turned away in disbelief, I noticed on the bedside table a pint glass containing the dregs of a deadly cocktail of pills and milk. The same beer glass that had held far too many Carlsberg specials in recent years was now redundant, containing nothing but the deadly residue of a much swifter poisoning. Once I'd taken in this grim reality, I began to become more aware of the people around me. My mother was sitting on a chair beside the bed, rocking back and forward, crying a deeper cry than I had ever heard. She was clutching a note in her hand. I hugged her as tightly as I could, for I don't know how long. "What am I going to do without you?" she kept asking. "What am I going to do without you?" She showed me the tear-stained note written in my father's scrawling handwriting. "Betty, love, you'll have a happier life without me." "What am I going to do without you?" my mother repeated. I read the suicide note again. "Betty, love, you'll have a happier life without me." Then I looked at my mother. "What am I going to do without you?" she wept. Then I looked at my dead father. "What have you done?" I thought. "Why have you left us? Would you rather be dead than be with us?" My mother read out the note again and again. "How could I have a happy life without him?" she cried. Then I felt angry. "Stupid, stupid man. You were supposed to be a very clever man, you know. How many times have I heard that? How could you do this to her? How could you do this to us? How could you do this to me?" Then I felt guilty. What if I had been there? Why didn't he feel he could call me to help him? I could have stopped this. How did I miss the signs? Auntie Ella led the minister into the room, and he began to pray for us. Auntie Dot and Auntie Betty and the family doctor were here now too. As the minister prayed, I turned to God in grief and pain, and I felt the first of many tears flowing down my nose and cheeks and onto my chin and down my neck. The more distressed I became, the more it upset everyone else, so I pulled myself together and went to cry in private in my old childhood bedroom like a real man. As I lay on the bed trying to come to terms with the events of the past hour, I felt angry again. "Selfish, selfish bastard," I thought. Then I felt guilty again. "I'm angry, but you were ill, and you didn't know what you were doing. I was more worried about helping a shower of ungrateful wee shites on the peace line than about you being depressed. I wasn't here for you, Daddy. I'm sorry, Daddy, I'm sorry." I sobbed into my childhood pillow until it was soaked. The turmoil in my mind was interrupted when the RUC arrived. My older brother hadn't reached the house yet, so I had to be interviewed as the most coherent next of kin on the scene. The policemen were kind, but it was obvious from some of the questions that they had to rule out foul play. They were just doing their job, but I was offended by the suggestion that anyone in our family would want to kill my father. When the police departed, I went into the sitting room for some relief from all the wailing. This was the same good room where every year my father had put up the Christmas tree and left us presents from Santa. This was the room where he introduced us to each new generation of hi-fi and speakers. I found my wee brother sitting there on his own, still in his school uniform, looking out the window in a daze. I was 23 years old, and this was tough for an adult like me. But my younger brother was only 16 years old, still at school, and had arrived home from classes and rugby practice to find his father had killed himself. "Are you all right?" I asked. "What do you think?" he answered. I hugged him. "We'll get through this," I said. But as his eyes searched my face, I knew that neither of us was convinced by my words at that moment. My father's good friend, Uncle Harry, joined us, and putting our grief before his own, he gave us a wee talk about having to be strong young men for the sake of our mother now. By this stage, the tea-making operations were in full swing in the kitchen, and wider family and friends were arriving along with sandwiches and buns and tray bakes from half the street. My older brother arrived, and Auntie Dot and the doctor eventually persuaded my mother to leave her husband's side, and they more or less carried her down the stairs to the sitting room. She sat in the big chair of the best suite, beside the good unit, with the porcelain figurines of the Queens of England that my father had bought her for birthdays and Christmases and anniversaries. She just sat there with a box of tissues, staring, weeping, and biting her nails furiously. The ambulance arrived, a little late, I thought. I had never before encountered so many emergency services in such a short space of time. My father's body was removed from the house. We watched through the windows of the sitting room as the stretcher transferred his remains into the redundant vehicle. "I never thought I'd see him leave this house like this," cried my mother in wide-eyed disbelief. I felt sick. As the ambulance drove off, Lesley arrived, and I went to her immediately. She didn't need to say anything, and she just held me for a while. I needed to get out of the house, so after a while we slipped away, and Lesley took me to Cave Hill Country Park, which overlooks the city. We walked along the side of the Cave Hill in the rain. I repeated the events of the day, the phone call at work, the beer glass with the deadly potion, my mother's screams, and the suicide note. Lesley listened as I repeated the details again and again, until I truly believed it all. She held my hand, and we walked and talked and embraced. The strange mix of conflicting emotions confused me. I was shocked and sad and angry and guilty all at the same time. He always said no son of his should do this or do that. No son of mine is going to look down his nose at no one. No son of mine is going to spend his life working for buttons in no dirty foundry. Well, no father of mine should ever have done what he did today. No father of mine should kill himself and break his wife's heart 7 months before his son's wedding day. Did he not want to come to our wedding? He certainly wrecked it now. Lesley said it was okay to be angry, and I explained how guilty I felt. "I'm so busy out to save the whole bloody world, and I couldn't even save my own father," I cried. Lesley listened and didn't judge me and just loved me the way she always did. As we sat together in silence on a park bench overlooking Belfast Loch, I gradually felt an unexpected peace overwhelm me. Maybe it was Lesley's love. Maybe it was my father's spirit. Perhaps it was God carrying me through the storm. Maybe I was in shock, or just more resilient than I thought. When I returned to the house, I acted as the strong person people expected me to be. I awoke the next day, and it dawned on me that it had not been a bad dream. I prayed for strength for the awful day ahead. When I got up, I could feel the pain of loss as a gnawing ache in my limbs. It hurt to clench the fingers on my hands. However, as the day went on, I noticed that although I felt more bereft, shaken and upset than I had ever been in my life, I was not completely devastated. I was still me. I was broken-hearted, but I was not broken. Of course, I immediately felt guilty again for not being completely torn apart emotionally. But I had a choice to make, and I decided that day I was not going to be a victim of this. No son of his was going to be no victim of no one. I had an unexpected assurance that I was strong enough to get through this loss and pain. I had an early sense that with the help of God and family and friends, I would survive this. I don't know where this strength came from, but in the days ahead, it settled at my core. I made a conscious choice that I would survive this awful hurt in my life. On the day of the funeral, We 3 Macaulay boys walked behind the coffin of our father Eric. Hundreds of people gathered at Wilton's funeral home on the Crumlin Road. Men from Mackie's Foundry, neighbours from our estate, and couples who had met at the Westie disco my parents had helped to run. Even some local politicians were there to pay their respects, along with the same family and friends who would shortly be receiving wedding invitations for my happy day. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my brothers to welcome people to the funeral chapel, which was too small to contain all of the mourners. I shook hundreds of hands. Everyone asked how my poor mother was doing. Everybody said they were very sorry for my loss, so they were, and all of them agreed that my father had been a great fella, so he had. I'll never forget what your mummy and daddy did for us at that wee disco every Saturday night. He was a very, very well-respected man in that foundry, son. He was fair to all the men, no matter what. He was a decent creator, so he was. We're all praying for yous in the church. He loved you 3 wee boys. You were his whole life. Clearly not, I thought bitterly. Is the wedding still on? Asked several sincere mourners. Of course it is. It's what he would have wanted, I replied, while at the same time wondering afresh why my own father had gone to such extremes to avoid giving a speech on my big day. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone how he died, whispered Mrs. Piper. He took his own life, I replied. It's not a secret. It's nothing to be ashamed of, she said. I'm not ashamed, I replied curtly. Depression is an illness like any other. There's no shame in being ill. All the men did their respective lifts of the coffin, and as we followed the hearse down the Crumlin Road, I could see the sombre young faces of me and my brothers reflected in the smoked glass of the rear window of the hearse. We looked so sad, but united and strong at the same time. Then we boarded the funeral cars, similar to the wedding cars we would soon use, and we followed the hearse to Roselawn Crematorium, where most of the dearly departed of Belfast were turned to ashes. As the coffin descended into the fire, I held my mother's hand. This was the worst part. It felt as if the flesh of my mother's heart was tearing apart right beside me, and I knew she would never heal. I sat there on the hard, cold wooden pew in sullen grief until I once again had to lead the shaking of the hands of a multitude of mourners who genuinely didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to say either. By the end of the day, I was exhausted with the polite public condolences and my mix of conflicting emotions. The only thing I knew for certain was that these last 3 days had changed my life forever. A few weeks later, on the far side of Roselawn Cemetery, we planted a tree in my father's memory. We placed a small plaque at the foot of the trunk engraved with the words, Alexander Macaulay, 1928 to 1986, out of the shadows into the sunshine. On the first day I visited the ash tree, I suddenly remembered a conversation I had had with my father shortly before he died. He had been giving me a lift when out of the blue he had said, When my father died, I thought I would never get over it, son. I was heartbroken. I thought it was the end of the world. But I was all right in the end, you know. I now understood what he was trying to say to me. It hurt so much I could still feel the loss as a physical sensation. My chest ached and my arms hurt as if I'd been stretched on a rack. I had a deep and constant pain in the palm of my hands. But I knew in my heart, just as he had said, that I would be all right in the end. A few months later, I borrowed the Fiat Panda to visit my father's tree. It was a typical wet and windy day in the hills of East Belfast, and the ash sapling bent a little in the wind. I spoke to my father and thanked him for all the sacrifices he had made for me and for giving me a happy childhood and a good start in life. I must have looked odd standing there with rain and tears on my cheeks, talking to a little tree. I told him I forgave him for leaving us, and I said I was sorry I hadn't been there to stop him killing himself. I told him he had been a good father. When I got back into the shelter of the car to drive back to my mother's house, I heard the warm voice of Candy Devine on downtown radio introducing a classic hit from the 1960s by Engelbert Humperdinck. From the first few notes I recognised my parents' favourite song, The Last Waltz. This was the song they had danced to the night they won the ballroom dancing competition at Butlins in Mosney in 1977. I remembered my 14-year-old self watching with pride as my mother and father glided together to victory across the faded glory of the Butlins ballroom. Then I remembered that this song was always the final 45 my father played when he was the DJ at the Westie Disco on Saturday nights in the 1970s. The young people of the Upper Shankill understood that the last waltz meant the disco was over for another week, and the dance floor cleared as throngs of teenagers made their way out of the Nissen hut for a chippy or a snog or both. But I knew the song had a deeper meaning. Every Saturday night my father was reminding my mother that he loved her. I turned up the radio so that the last waltz would drown out my sobs. I had the last waltz with you, two lonely people together. I fell in love with you. The last waltz should last forever.